Hello and welcome to the next episode of Tales from the CyberLab. In this episode, we're going to be talking around data protection compliance. So in the last episode, we were talking about from the insurance perspective and what the first things that we should be doing are when we have a data incident or a cyber incident. And one of the messages that came across very clear from Eric in the last episode was that contacting your legal representation is the first thing that you should be doing before you start doing anything else, so that they can guide what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done. And to that end, with us today, I've got Emma Loveday Hill from Pretty Solicitors. Emma, welcome to the podcast. And would you like to just introduce yourself and tell the good people a little bit about what you do?
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me today. So I'm Emma Loveday Hill, and I'm partner and head of the data protection and privacy team at Pretty Solicitors.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So with the format of these podcasts is that first of all, we'll talk about the what, then we'll talk about the why, and then we talk about the how of how we actually go about doing data protection compliance in the right way. So let's start off with what data protection compliance actually means. It's about ensuring that personal data that must be protected is being adequately protected. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that? What's kind of the first step in doing that?
So that's a really good question, because I think the first thing that we've got to think about is what actually are we talking about when we say personal data? Because it's easy to kind of think, well, actually, we're talking about all data, but what we're actually worried about from a UK GDPR perspective and a data protection perspective is what's defined as personal data. And so personal data is data that means that we can identify a living individual. And so it's data that relates to them. We're not talking about, commercial data or financial data or trade secrets or anything that's it might be commercially sensitive. In this context, what we are talking about is personal data.
So it's about individuals and about humans, not about anything else.
No, exactly that. So we're talking about the data and the information that relates to a person. And that data or information has to be able to identify that person as well. So if it's anonymous data, then even though it might have related to a person once upon a time, it's not got to be protected in the same way.
That was a really good definition of it, but it's often left me scratching my head thinking, what does that actually mean? Can we give examples of what sorts of data that the kind of thing that would allow someone to be identified? So I guess a name is an obvious example.
Yeah, that's right. So you've got name, address, job title. That's another common one, because obviously if you've got a job title and you know that it's the CEO of CyberLab, then the person could be identified from that.
Yeah, you could tie it up with LinkedIn or what have you.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also data that's kind of less obvious. So even an IP address, that can be personal data because it can identify a person from that data.
Okay.
But we usually see it in terms of names, that kind of obvious data. But of course, you've still got to look more widely at what it could be.
So it's a big part of this is understanding, one, how you identify that data, and then I guess you need to really appreciate why it needs to be protected, and that's that comes into fraud and all of these other things. I mean, I don't think we've got time here to list all of the top possible scenarios that data could be misused, but hopefully the audience has got enough awareness to understand that there's a reason for this stuff to be protected, and that is the reason in essence. We're talking about data, and the advice is always that in any cyber incident that you should be talking to your legal firms first, just to understand and make sure, double check that whether or not something has been breached with a data perspective. But a lot of cyber incidents could be down to anything. I mean, we've got the CrowdStrike one. That's a cyber incident, and it was actually involving no third parties whatsoever. It was unfortunately just a mismanagement of how software was being tested and deployed. So let's talk around what is a data breach. At what point does a data breach become an actual breach that something has to be done about it?
So I've already mentioned the UK GDPR and the data protection of 2018. Those are the two main pieces of legislation that we're always thinking about when we're working with data protection and privacy. So the UK GDPR, just to be clear, is essentially still the same as the EU GDPR that was introduced in 2018, but it has just changed to UK GDPR following Brexit. Under the GDPR, the definition is that there has to be a breach of security relating to personal data, essentially leading to kind of a loss or inaccessibility or something that happens to data that shouldn't have happened to it. It's about a security incident that relates to personal data. In terms of what that can look like, it doesn't always have to be kind of an obvious, cyber attack or something like that. It can be, it's not always just going to be losing the data. People always talk about the old examples were leaving a USB stick on a bus or that kind of thing. That's not what we're really talking about now, but it can be more straightforward than that. It can even be emailing the wrong person. That could be a data breach. It will depend on what content is.
And we've all done that.
Exactly. It's one of the easiest things.
It's embarrassing, and you cringe as soon as you realise what you've done, but it does happen, unfortunately. So we've talked around what a data breach is and what that means. Now, what are the obligations on us as the organisation that thinks that we've suffered some kind of a data breach? Who needs to be notified, and how quickly must that be done?
So in the UK, the regulator is the Information Commissioner's Office, who we call the ICO. And now the ICO are who would need to be notified where there has been a reportable data breach. And whether a breach is going to be reportable will depend on whether there is a risk to people's rights and freedoms. So whether there is a risk to those data subjects whose data is involved in that breach or not. So that's when the ICO would need to be notified. In addition to that, the individual data subjects involved may also need to be informed about the data breach and given certain information to help them mitigate the risks to their data and what's happened if there's a high risk to them. So that's a slightly higher threshold than reporting to the ICO. But essentially, if a client came to me, what we would do is we'd say, has there been a personal data breach? If the answer to that is yes, then we would help them then assess whether the Information Commissioner needs to be notified. And then if they do, then we'd help them fill in those forms and report the breach. And at the same time, we'd be assessing whether the individual data subjects also need to be told or not, because if there's a high risk to their rights, then that's when they would need to be notified. So we would look at that at the same time. And we would also be working out, if they do need to be notified and informed, what that is going to look like. So we'd work through every step of the process. There might also be other organisations that need to be notified, for example, the police, if there's been any criminal activity involved, or there might be other regulatory requirements. And actually, depending on the type of organisation, then there can be other requirements under the legislation, even so under the privacy and electronic communication regulations, for example. So there are other obligations that we kind of look at. So we look at the whole picture, and we start with the client from hopefully the very earliest stage, and work them through to that end stage. And then, and if it is reportable, then we would help with that.
It's really interesting for me as someone that's got no sort of legal background whatsoever. I've moved away from being a technical specialist now to a certain extent, but I still consider myself a techie. And this is potentially a real minefield. There's lots of different regulatory bodies that could be involved. There's the Financial Conduct Authority. I would imagine that they're going to have stipulations and things like that. So the fact that you guys have got this specialist knowledge so that we can leverage that and lean on you guys and say to guide us, I think that's invaluable, really. And it was, again, I said this in the last podcast that my go-to is not contact legal when we've got a problem. It's like start trying to work the problem and start trying to get things under control. And this just reiterates to me the need to make sure that you're doing it properly. You're contacting legal, and you're then getting your ducks lined up to make sure that you're telling everyone that needs to be notified and limit the damage that potentially could be done to your organisation.
The other thing, just ties into what you were just saying, is the time limits are so short in terms of making sure that if you have to report it, then you have to report it within 72 hours, becoming aware of that breach. And that includes weekends, it includes bank holidays, it includes overnight. So 72 hours starts to run if it can be reported to the ICO. If you don't have all the information.
Do we get some leniency around Christmas?
No, unfortunately not.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
So if you find out about something on Christmas Eve, then you're going to have to work over Christmas to find
data breaches will ruin your Christmas. Great.
They could do, exactly.
News. Yeah. All right. So I've just talked about sort of, we've talked about how quickly you've got to do it. What if you don't do it? What could happen then?
If we don't report to the ICO in time within that 72-hour period, then the first thing to do is actually make sure you report it as soon as possible after, and give reasons why you delayed and not giving them all the information. If there has been an issue and it hasn't been reported to the ICO in time, then the ICO can actually issue a fine of up to 2% of annual global turnover, up to £8.7 million. And so the financial implications could be rather severe. That, of course, on top of that, the ICO can also issue a fine for actually what's caused the breach itself, for the non-compliance or the breach that's happened as well. And that can be up to 4% of annual global turnover, or 17.5 million. So we are talking about big numbers here. I think the thing to remember is that we actually, so far, we haven't seen fines of that level issued by the ICO, and they will take, what measures you've taken into account. And so, that's only going to be in the most extreme cases. It's not automatically a 2% or a 4% fine. It's looking at what's appropriate.
But still potentially very expensive consequences, significant consequences for not adhering to that 72-hour notification window. We've talked around what data protection compliance means, and I feel like I've got a much better understanding of that now than I did have at the start of the podcast. So now let's put some context around this and talk about why this is so important. Now, I think when I did look at some of the figures from the ICO, and 27 of the reported breaches in Q1 this year were cyber related. So that means that they were either down to, so it was a cyber threat related, really. It was either down to phishing or malware attacks. And does that by and large make up most of what you deal with?
To be honest, most of the breaches that we deal with are actually, down to human error or issues that happen because of people sending things to the wrong place, or information being accessed that shouldn't be accessed, and that kind of thing, rather than the cyber side of things. And I think that's probably reflected in the figures, because 27% out of all the breaches, the most common the most common type of breach reported to the ICO actually relates to emails being sent to the wrong person.
I knew you were going to say email, because that's just, everyone uses it. We're busy, we rush. It's so easy to make a mistake.
It is. And the thing is, even though every breach won't be reportable, it's really important that you keep records of those breaches, because actually, if you can see a pattern emerging, then you might want to look at putting something in place to stop that pattern happening and continuing. So if every breach, if 9 out of 10 of your breaches within an organization are email related, then actually you might need to put something in place to stop, the automatic emails being completed, that kind of thing. So it's really helpful to keep a record, because that can be assessed and looked at and kind of reviewed, because at least then you've identified that there's a gap or a need for something else. Under the GDPR, you have to take reasonable measures to keep data safe and secure. And so that's the kind of thing that we'd be looking at, and when you've got your personal data, where it is and how is it being kept secure, and how are you preventing it being used, inappropriately or in a way that it shouldn't be used.
But looking at the cyber related, these result then in, these are targeted attacks that that the attackers are trying to get this personal identity, this personal data. And really it comes down to the old adage as information is power, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's completely true. And I mean, you've got to look at this in a wider context than just personal data, actually, because, if you are subject to a cyber attack, then what data are they going to get? What's going to be able to be accessed? Because yes, we've been talking about personal data, but there's also, commercial data or commercially sensitive data or financial data that could have a massive impact on your business, as well as the personal data implications and obligations being breached under the GDPR. So you've got to look at it from a whole commercial perspective. And that's why it's really important to protect it. I mean, the thing is, we talked about the fines for the levels of the fines that the ICO can issue, but actually it's wider than that. You've got to think about, the wider financial implications in terms of, downtime, time to take to investigate it, the costs of, doing forensic investigations to what happened, all of those kinds of things. And actually tied into that is perhaps maybe one of the more important things is actually loss of reputation. You think of the CrowdStrike stuff that happened. It's had a massive impact on their reputation and potentially it could go much wider than that. But any organization that's subject to a data breach is going to be in the spotlight. And that means that not only are the ICO going to be looking at them more closely, the wider public will be looking at them more closely because they'll potentially lost trust in that organization and their ability to protect their data.
Yeah, and this is so. I mean, this is one of the things that I am quite passionate about and trying to raise awareness and make sure that the understanding is there in the customers and the colleagues and peers that I talk to, is around the wider picture about the damage that can be done by having a cyber instance. It's not just, I mean, we're talking about cyber incidents. I mean, CrowdStrike is a perfect example. There was no ransomware or anything. Typically, when we're talking about these things, that the unwritten, if we don't actually speak about it, but the implication is that we're talking about people hacking or a ransomware incident, people being breached initially via phishing emails and stuff like that. But the CrowdStrike instance was really a perfect example of a sort of big cyber incident that's caused widespread disruption. I think it was 8.5 million Windows endpoints, and that's actually less than 1% of the Windows endpoints across the world, which kind of terrifies me a little bit. That what if something wider happened? What would be the global effect of that? But let's not talk about doom and gloom in that regard. But it is really about the reputational damage and about the fact that people just won't want to work with you. I mean, there's companies that I've been looking at in my role as a vendor manager. Then I'm also looking at onboarding new vendors, and I have to look at their history. Now, there are some vendors that, I'm quite happy to onboard, even though they've had a breach in the past. And the reason for that is because I've looked at how they conducted themselves in the immediate wake of that breach. One of these companies, I was a personal customer of them. I've used them for a long time. And their communication was really, really good. And when I look at the model of how that management of the incident and the data protection, when I look at the framework of how they're supposed to do it, this particular vendor did it impeccably. And they were then really upfront and open about explaining to their customers and to the sort of the wider world, I suppose, about how it actually happened and how they've remediated, what action they've taken, but also what protective measures they've now put in place. And it's actually made me think that, as much as reputational damage can be a cause for concern, if you've had a data breach and you've conducted yourself really well, I think that that's actually a good indication.
Yeah.
And the reason that I say this is that I'm very much of the opinion it started off when people had data breaches. Oh, that company, they've done this, or they've dropped the ball and they've done this, that, and the other. The way that cybersecurity is today, and the way that the threat landscape is, and the way that it's commoditized and that it's all financially motivated, certainly when we're talking about the cyber attack element of it, I think really it's only a matter of time until most organizations have suffered something like this. And that's what's kind of brought me around to saying, well, I won't disregard someone purely because they've had one data breach or they've had a significant incident. If, however, there's an example that in the last couple of months they've had multiple incidents, that kind of signifies to me that they're not taking it seriously and they're not doing what they need to be doing to protect themselves against this.
It does, but equally, as you said, how a company handles itself is really important, because actually, if you've got, if you know that they're handling it correctly and doing everything that they should do, then that kind of mitigates the other impact on a data subject or on that relationship. And I think this really just highlights how important it is for companies to have data breach notification policies in place and make sure that staff know what to do if there is a data breach. It could be somebody really junior who identifies a data breach, but they might not know that it is a data breach or know what to do with it. So training is going to be really important. And that's actually one of the things that the Information Commissioner's Office expects staff to be trained on data protection generally. And it helps to demonstrate that, you have mitigating factors and steps and methods.
This actually
place.
I get what I know exactly what you mean. So this actually comes back to something I touched upon at the start of the last episode, and it's around cybersecurity not just being the responsibility or the realm of one particular area of the business and everyone else can just sort of carry on regardless. It's something now that very much needs to be endemic within the entire organization.
Yeah.
You touched upon the need of having processes and policies in place. This again, having a cyber incident plan and having it so that you've got all stakeholders of the business, you can pull them together quickly, you can assess what's going on, which area of the business has been affected, and what are the next steps. Is data involved? Straight away we need to contact legal. It's having that stuff in place, and it's not easy to do. And it's not something that will happen quickly either, because this mentality of like someone that manages the stock cupboard or something like that, cybersecurity just isn't. They don't necessarily understand what it's all about. They know that it's important and that things like that, but they might not really appreciate what their role in it is, even though their role is potentially just as vital as senior people in the business that are making these decisions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it has to be, throughout the organization, throughout business, that everybody understands what they're looking for and what their obligations are in terms of data protection. Particularly when we look at how, short the timeframes are for reporting a breach, if it's a reportable breach. You don't have very long, so you don't want somebody to sit on it. And this is that common thing where somebody doesn't report, that they haven't quite known what to do with it. And I've seen this so many times where somebody hasn't known that there's a data breach or hasn't known exactly that it is a data breach. And they've sat on it until the end of the week, till a Friday afternoon, when they've suddenly thought, I'm on holiday next week, I need to email this to my manager so that they can do something with it.
And it's also reducing the stigma. Everyone makes mistakes, and and no one is completely infallible. And it's not about blaming people when things like this happen.
No.
I mean, if you've gone completely over, above and beyond, making sure that your staff are completely clued up on this stuff, maybe there's a bit of a case to answer there. But most of the time, it's just these things. Unfortunately, accidents happen. People make mistakes. It's very easy when you're busy and you've got a lot of things going on. And just, because you've made the mistake, the business needs to know about it. The sooner they know about it, the sooner they can do something about it.
Yeah. No, exactly. That no blame culture is really important. And, even the ICO has a lot of guidance about breaches and lots of helpful information on their website, actually. But, even they make it clear that as long as it's not done maliciously, there's no blame going to be apportioned to that person. It's the data controller as a whole rather than that person. So we don't want people to be worried about coming forward about something. I mean, it might be that, there's a disciplinary matter or a performance issue or something else that needs to be addressed. But we need ultimately the people to come forward and say, look, I've discovered this, or this has happened. What do I do next? Or actually, even better, here's all the information you need to carry out the assessment. And so, so businesses might have template forms in place so that everybody knows as soon as something has happened, they fill in a form that gives all the required information that allows the data controller or whoever's responsible within that data controller, the business, shared data protection to make an assessment of whether the ICO needs to be notified. But they've then got all the facts in front of them.
So that kind of brings us to the last area about where we talk about the how of we actually, how do we do that? So how do we ensure data protection compliance is where it needs to be in our organization? And I guess the first part of that is controlling your personal data, or the data that holds personally identifiable information, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So it's really important to understand what personal data you have within the organization, and then knowing where it is and what security measures are in place to protect data.
And I think that's a really good point, because it's so easy now, especially for organizations that have been around. There's been such a transition from our traditional on-prem way of storing data in file servers and stuff like that to now cloud. I mean, we had Dropbox, and there were other file sharing systems as well that have been around for quite a while. But the real danger is that our data has become so scattered and distributed across all of these different areas that it then becomes incredibly difficult, one, to even understand what data we have, let alone actually put in any kind of effective protection.
Exactly.
So
And the other thing to add into that, sorry to interrupt you, is just, think about data retention policies, because data shouldn't be kept for any longer than it needs to be to serve the purpose, why you've got it. And actually having data retention policies mean that you are deleting data after a certain amount of time, reduces the amount of personal data that you hold, which actually helps in a situation like this, because of course then there's less data involved.
So just following on from you were talking about data retention. So I think it's also appropriate. It's also important that you put appropriate security measures in place to protect that personal data and prevent it from being potentially mishandled. I mentioned this before, that you can put data loss prevention. So that can be as simple as preventing maybe passport or credit card numbers being sent out through email, and most people's firewalls will have that capability built into it. But the way to really do it, to my mind anyway, is to be doing the full data categorization piece. So categorize all your data. That will allow you to identify which data is sensitive, whether it's financially sensitive, commercially sensitive, personal identifiable information sensitive. And then you can enforce controls around that, so that if someone does try to email it by accident, or they send it to the wrong person, you can, these things can be quite complex to manage, but it really gives you peace of mind that the chances of this then happening and you becoming one of those statistics that's in the vast majority of data breaches is because of email, or that your data's been exfiltrated, it reduces that significantly. So the next bit, I think, is understanding the standards that you are expected to adhere to, and the level of compliance that you're expected to meet. So I guess you must need to know what to do, when to do it, and how to do it.
So it touches on stuff that we've already talked about a little bit today, but it's really important to understand what personal data you hold, why you hold it, where it's stored, and how it's being protected. Under the UK GDPR, the obligation is to make sure that there's appropriate technical and organisational security measures in place to protect that data. What that looks like is going to vary on a case-by-case, business-to-business organisation. There's no one set standard, and it doesn't always come down to how much it costs financially and those kind of things. It's what's going to be appropriate in that particular case, and that's going to depend on what data it is and how sensitive it is, or what you're doing with it, and that kind of thing.
Okay, so it's records, policies, and template forms. How do we go about using those things to make this easier to do?
So the starting point is always to make sure that you have what we call a record of processing activities. And that's a requirement under the GDPR anyway, to have a document in place that sets out all the information about the personal data. And then because you know where everything is, and it's department by department, every bit of personal data should be covered in that document. Then on top of that, we'd make sure that you should have a data protection policy in place that sets out your general attitude to data protection. But in terms of data breaches specifically, I'd say it's really, really important to make sure that you have got a data breach notification policy, which sets out what a data breach is, what to do in the event of the breach, and the contact details for who needs to be told about the breach internally. Having that in place means that any member of staff can then find out the information they need. If something happens, they can look and decide whether there might have been a personal data breach and what to do with it next. That ties into them making sure that there are template assessment forms in place. So we would recommend two. There's one for notifying the Information Commissioner's Office, and there's also one to assess whether the individual data subjects also need to be notified. The final thing I think to have is then a record of your data breaches. That doesn't have to be anything complicated. It's just making sure that you are tracking your data breaches that occur. And also, if you're then not reporting any to the Information Commissioner's Office, you're then making sure that you're keeping a record of them, so that you can say that there have been breaches, but this hasn't been needed to be notified because of this reason. And that can be really important, particularly if there is then a subsequent data breach that does need to be notified, because the ICO can see
you've got a sort of a breadcrumb trail to follow, haven't you?
Yeah, that's it. And it's all about being able to demonstrate your accountability.
So I think really, the final step is really around making sure that you're prepared. And we talked about this previously around how prepared people are to deal with data breaches and knowing what they need to do and when they need to do it. And I think this is kind of, it's the same approach that I would suggest around business continuity or disaster recovery, anything like that, is that running tabletop exercises and stuff like that, run simulations of this has happened, how is the business going to respond to this, so that you can test the processes and procedures that you've put in place. But it also means that you can hammer out any kinks that come up in there where there's an air gap in communications, for example, or something, something breaks down because, oh, hang on a second, we're supposed to talk to this person, but they're off on holiday today. Like, where, that can highlight the need for, okay, well, who's their deputy in that instance, sort of thing, and things like that. And then finally, record keeping, I think, is the one that kind of, it makes sense, but you may not instantly think about it, especially if it's something that you don't need to report, but it then becomes very, very relevant when you're doing that sort of forensic audit trail, or you're having to backtrack and provide evidence to say, well, look, this is what this is how we approach breaches. We're recording everything, we've investigated everything, but these ones have not needed to be notified. The ICO's not been needed to be notified. And I think really that kind of sums it up, and that's all we've got time for. For anyone who's watching, if you have concerns around data protection compliance and you want to make sure that you're doing it better, please reach out to CyberLab. There's contact details on the webpage below this video. We offer a cyber posture assessment, so that can look at your data compliance as well as everything else across the field of cybersecurity in your organization. And there's also a free trial of a really useful tool that is used. I find it really good for categorizing data. So it will help you to hunt down and categorize your data much easier using AI and machine learning than you would do having to do it manually through some of the other solutions that are out there. And that's delivered by ForcePoint, and it's known as the Data Security Posture Management Tool. And it's a free trial that you can get to use that and see how easy it could be to categorize your data and then start to put some controls around it. Okay, that's all for this episode. Hopefully next time I'll be back in the office and not doing it from my garden in the lovely Forest of Dean. But I hope you've taken something away from that. It's an area that is a little bit of a black art to me, and hopefully this has shone some light on the area of data protection for you. If you want any further information, please reach out to CyberLab, or you can reach out to me via LinkedIn. So that's it for this time. Stay secure.